Hello, everyone. Welcome to a new episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour. My name is Ato Quayson, and I am Professor and Chair of the English Department at Stanford University. I will be the host of each Contours episode. Each episode will address a pressing issue, theme, or concept in 21st century literary studies. In many of these episodes, I'll be hosting a dialogue with an author or authors from the Cambridge University press list. Others will feature a panel of experts in the field, and I will introduce those episodes too. We aim to provide an invigorating, accessible forum for critical debate and reflection to engage and help our students, teachers, and general readers. Contours will range from medieval literature to the present day, from all areas of global literary studies in the Northern and Southern hemispheres. Each episode will be approximately an hour and will be available via YouTube on our new Contours page on Cambridge Core. In today's episode, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by Christopher Morash, Professor of English at Trinity College Dublin, to discuss Dublin, a writer's city, and Professor T.R. Johnson at Tulane University to discuss New Orleans, a writer's city. Both books are part of the Imagining City series edited by Professor Morash. We hope you find this episode of Contours, the Cambridge Literary Studies Hour, useful, enjoyable, and relevant, and more importantly, that you are encouraged to join us again for the next edition. So, gentlemen, I read your books with great interest because, you know, I'm a bit of a cityphile myself, but the effect on me was to be transported to the two cities, and in a very vivid way, and I kept imagining the little bits that I know of the two cities. Now, what I want to open, the first question I want to open with is, what was your inspiration? So give us your inspiration for writing the two books, and also your overall plan, you know, the way you planned and structured it. So this would help our listeners also to be transported as I was. So can I start with Chris?
Yeah, thanks, Ato. Thanks for that very generous introduction as well. This I suppose comes from the fact that I've lived in Dublin since 1985, but I'm not from Dublin originally, and those years since 1985 for me have been a process of kind of building a city of the imagination. I've worked in Dublin, I've lived in Dublin, I've studied its literature during all that time, and I've had a kind of growing sense of the city kind of being added to in texture for me, becoming more real for me the more I read about it. For instance, I mean, when I remember the first day I arrived in Dublin, 1985, September 1985. And I was staying in Westland Row, which is right in the center of the city. And I realized that outside my front door to the right was Sweeney's chemist shop, which is where Leopold Bloom buys lemon soap from Molly Bloom in Ulysses. If I went around the corner, I come to Finn's Hotel, which is where Joyce met Nora Barnacle. If I went around, kept going just a little bit around that corner, I would come to the place where Samuel Beckett worked in his father's offices. If I went to the left, I'd come to what had been the theatre where Yeats staged his first play with the Dublin Literary Theatre, what becomes the Abbey, the Countess Kathleen, in 1899. And that was just the start. I started to realize this one little bit of street was populated by all these fictional characters and by their authors. And this has just become part of the way I inhabit the city. When I walk down the streets, I have a sense of all these literary figures around me. So I really want to share that. And I suppose that led to a series of conversations with the editor I work with in Cambridge, Ray Ryan. And Ray had wanted to do a book on Dublin. And we sat down one day, and interestingly enough, in the Dublin House pub in New York, we sat down to talk this over. And I had an idea for a book that would be laid out, not chronologically, not a history of literature in Dublin, but would be organized by space. That we would break the city up into zones, sort of affective zones, places that felt right together. And the idea grew from there. And Ray immediately said, look, this will work not just for Dublin, it'll work for other cities as well. And he said, and I know the person to do it from New Orleans.
Mm-hmm. There you are. So TR, how about you?
I'm well, and thank you so much, Ato, for that great introduction, and thank you, Chris, and to Ray for bringing me into this series to do the New Orleans book. It's been a labor of love, not surprisingly. You know, my story is analogous to Chris's. I did not grow up in New Orleans. I moved here in '99, so it's been almost 25 years that I've been living here. And like Chris, I began to experience the city intertwined with an experience of the literature of the city. I read about New Orleans before I had ever even visited here, and was enchanted by, I was reading Robert Stone's Hall of Mirrors, a novel of about 1967 that really conjures the atmosphere of the city in a way that is not the standard tourist vision of the city. And I was utterly enchanted and enthralled. It became a city in my imagination, you know, a full decade or more before it was a city that I knew as a resident and as someone working here. And as I began to settle into the city, I just began to read more and more about it. And to be like Chris, just kind of overwhelmed by the sheer density of the literary history that is here. And of course, the way it's intertwined too with other sort of cultural forms and cultural forces, music, most obviously, architecture too. And then more broadly still, questions of landscape and history. I'm thinking of swamps, the increasingly volatile and vanishing coastline. And then of course, I'm thinking of histories of enslavement that New Orleans played a role in, that is center, at the absolute center in many ways of the business of human trafficking through the American South in the antebellum era. And then the kind of staggering cultural flowering that happened a generation or two after emancipation. I'm thinking, of course, of jazz, and then the wave after wave of rhythm and blues and the gospel traditions. All of that creates an atmosphere here. As a friend of mine put it, music is in the air that the writers here breathe. And it becomes a real magnet for the literary imagination wherever it crops up, be it, you know, Texas or Kentucky or Chicago or wherever. People sort of migrate here. The river is a natural channel to bring people here historically. And from that original kind of germinal cultural hub of the 19th century, it just continued to grow and really to kind of explode in the 1920s, the 1940s, the 1960s. Wave after wave of major literary bohemias flourished here, and the written legacy is overwhelming. As you know, as Chris notes of Dublin, you can't round a corner without running into something that is immortalized in a novel or a play or a poem or a film in some cases. And when I began to work on this book, my first thought was, this is going to be impossible. But that's exactly why I'm going to take a shot at it and try to do it. Katrina had really galvanized my relationship to the city, to, you know, this notion that I couldn't just run around in it and love it and enjoy it. I had to start thinking about it with a particular urgency, given our new understanding that it could someday vanish. And so that became kind of, and like Chris, I hit upon this notion of, I wanted to take streets, major thoroughfares that anchor the various sections of the city, be it uptown, downtown, going out toward the lake, et cetera, the outskirts. And so for me, I wanted to anchor it on these major thoroughfares and understanding streets as a kind of primary artery that generations of writers have moved up and down, and responding to essentially the same blocks over the generations in ways that make a really fascinating cluster. Like Chris, avoiding a straightforward history and instead trying to cobble together a kind of geography of the way the city has lived in the human imagination through its writers, and understanding writers to mean as well lyricists, songwriters, you know, expanding to people who have worked with the human voice and the word to make art, as a colleague of mine put it. And so I, along with novelists and poets and playwrights, I think of Jelly Roll Morton, Alan Toussaint, Mahalia Jackson, the powerful voices.
Beyonce. You mentioned Beyonce at some point. I said, what the hell is she doing here? Yeah,
Beyonce, Frank Ocean, Lil Wayne, major forces for sure.
Yeah, yeah, wonderful, wonderful. They're both so evocative, and especially yours because there's music in there. Obviously, there's a lot of music. They're recognizable and not so recognizable names, but you can imagine how the various genres of music, of writing styles, and so on intersect to create this imaginative. I'll come back to you in a moment, TR. But let me go now, Chris. I noticed, and I found the book really fascinating. You know, you threw out, or you I don't know whether the word is the word to use is struggle, but you sort of play with different metaphors. It's like you're trying to find the best metaphor for, you know, thinking through the city. And one of them that became almost like incrementally, even though you mentioned it only a couple of times, is palimpsest. The city is very palimpsestic. Even the example that you opened with the pharmacy, I forget the name, the one Sweeney's. On the right. Sweeney's is now something else.
Yeah.
But it was Sweeney's before, and you know, and many residents of Dublin know that it was Sweeney's. So the Sweeney's of the past is sitting alongside the present day Sweeney, which is different. But you also refer to something similar, but it's on a larger scale, and it is the area around I think it's the docks, my notes are mixed up here, where you say that now it is the data, it's now populated with, you know, media, not media, social media, Facebook and so on, so that place suffers a kind of spatial thinning.
Yeah.
So spatial, so palimpsest, which deepens over time, spatial thinning, and then use a beautiful metaphor of if it was possible to visualize the data flows of that area, and you have to remind me what area it is. I have it in my notes, but
it's the Docklands area, basically.
The Docklands, okay.
Yeah.
But then you have a third metaphor, which is, and this is when you are describing the plan of the book, which is like a tree, inside the bark of a tree, which has different concentric circles. And so you are organizing it around these kind of circles that move out from, as it were, emotional, because you write of the spaces as having different emotional textures. You know, and it's like you want to convey each space as the bearer of now this array of metaphors, of ways of thinking. I'm wondering, what is it in Dublin itself that instigates this compulsion to metaphorize?
I think all three of these things kind of interact. I'll start with the tree first. That's really how Dublin grows. Dublin really starts as a settlement in around about the 8th century. We're not quite sure when. But it first becomes a town. It becomes a Viking town first, which makes it unusual in Ireland, you know, because we tend to think of Ireland as, you know, as being inhabited by a kind of, you know, Celtic, Gaelic people. Dublin is initially a Viking town, first really settled around about 840. And it starts in an area around Christchurch Cathedral. And so that's the old center. So the earliest map, really detailed map we have from about 1610, so about 800 years later, is centered around that area. There's a Dublin castle's built there and the city starts there. So that's your heartwood. That's the core of the tree. As that part of the city becomes congested, the city starts to move to the north side of the River Liffey. This is on the south side where the old center is. It starts to move out from that. It starts to move further out again later on in the 18th century. By the 19th century, it's moved out to another ring of suburbs. And then there's a big explosion of population in the mid 20th century where the city actually sprawls, you know, over quite a large area. So as you move through different zones in the city, you're moving through different architectural styles and different historical periods. There's a bridge in the city I drove over the other day, and I was in a part of the city that was Georgian. The houses were recognizably Georgian. The street ahead of me was red brick Victorian. And at the end of the street, I could see an apartment block going up that was contemporary. So you had kind of three eras right there happening on the street. Now that happens in every city, but in Dublin, because there was a long history of economic underdevelopment in Ireland, and by long I mean from really the end of the 18th century up until the 1990s, a lot of the old city didn't get replaced. So we're in cities like, city like New York, there's a building there, and then 10 years later, the building's gone. There's another building in that site. They knock it down. In Dublin, that didn't happen for a long, long time. Mm-hmm. So the old medieval streetscape is still there in the old part of the city, in the old Heartwood. The Georgian streetscape is still there, and the Georgian buildings are still there in the Georgian part of the city. The Victorian ring is still there, largely intact. So all that texture, all that material texture of history is there laid out in these concentric rings. And then what gets layered over that are different layers of inhabitants. So for instance, take a say a Georgian house. In say about 1750 or so, they start to build these townhouses. So you get these classical Georgian houses, what everybody thinks of when they think of Dublin. Fanlight over the door, 4 stories high, symmetrical, 2 windows, window on either side of the doors going up. They start out as houses of the aristocracy. By the early 19th century, they're starting to become tenements. By the end of the 19th century, they're some of the worst slums in Europe. And that's where writers like Sean O'Casey are living. So you get this layering happening. The thing that has happened recently in Ireland has been really unprecedented, and that's this wave of prosperity and globalized prosperity. In the early 2000s, the journal Foreign Policy did a kind of survey of the most globalized countries in the world, and Ireland came out as #1, like ahead of Singapore, ahead of Switzerland. So we went from being a very inward-looking country, economically underdeveloped, where things didn't change, to being the most globalized country in the world. So there's areas of the city that this globalization has manifested itself, where companies like Twitter, Airbnb, Meta, all have kind of European headquarters or European bases. And as I say, I can almost imagine the data flows in that area. You can just imagine that there's just data flying around everywhere. So on one hand, you have this kind of historical, stratification, and then sitting on top of it are these contemporary flows of data. Mm-hmm. And in that area where the data flows happen, in that Docklands area, you could be anywhere. There's a novelist, Paul Murray, who sets a novel of his, The Mark and the Void, there. And he says, we could be anywhere. We could be in Kuala Lumpur. We could be anywhere. And that's what the philosopher Edward Casey means by place thinning. You go there and it could be anywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's about recovering the memory of those other parts of the city that are stratified to balance that sense that there are parts of the city that have become anywhere and everywhere.
I like the thinning. I've never encountered it before, the place thinning or spatial thinning, because of course I experience it in hotels.
Yes.
A Marriott in Cape Town is a Marriott in a room. A Marriott in Cape Town is exactly like a room, the Marriott in Dublin. So you wake up in the middle of the night and you have to reorient yourself because they're all the same. Yeah. So I like this idea of the place thinning, which is a product actually of globalization.
Yes.
But what you are doing, I think, quite wonderfully in the book is against that place thinning effect, the product of globalization. You're also invoking the various, you've actually just explained, the various different memoried, parts of the city, which, as it were, contrast with the place-thinned zones. I'll come back to you, Chris, in a moment.
Yeah.
ask you to prod you a bit more on the emotional idea, the idea of emotional zones, which was also very fascinating to me. Now, TR, I also enjoyed Dublin. A friend of mine many years ago, I hadn't been to Dublin before, and he says, Ato, you must, sorry, not to Dublin. Dublin I've been, but at the time I hadn't been to New Orleans. He said, Ato, you must go to New Orleans. It's the best of the best iniquities. So I said, it's a place of the best iniquities in the whole world. So I always thought of New Orleans as a space of the best iniquities. Of course, what you show here is that it has much more than simply joyous iniquities. But you focus on different streets. So you organize the book around streets, and take us along one of those streets. I have a follow-up question, which I'll ask later, and that is the relationship between New Orleans and water.
Oh, yeah.
So you mentioned it, but take us along one of those streets.
Gosh, let me see. I work with 5 main ones in the city in the book, and then in my 6th chapter I talk about the outskirts. They are all they're very distinct. It's a city of very distinct neighborhoods, and borrowing Chris's metaphor, I don't use this word palimpsest in the book, but these streets are palimpsest. There's always another layer. It's interesting. One of the streets I talk about is Esplanade Avenue. It's sort of a personal favorite of mine simply because it is so beautiful. It has this live oak canopy that stretches a couple of miles from the river out to the what is now City Park, what was an old cypress swamp back in the 19th century. And at the outermost end, that what is now a park was the dueling ground where these Creole gentlemen would settle questions of honor. It's where a legendary outlaw maroon named Bras Coupe, severed arm, used to really provoke the public imagination of the city with his raids on the taverns along the outskirts, and caused worries about ultimately sparking something like a Haitian revolution here. And so that's at the outermost end. Just beyond that park is the barracks of what was called the Colored Waifs Home, where a certain Louis Armstrong first lifted a horn to his lips. When he was just a street waif who'd gotten locked up for firing a pistol on New Year's Eve, they put him in there, and there was a band, and mysteriously, he suddenly is the leader of the band. And then, and from there, the rest is history. And that's just the outermost end of Esplanade. At the river end is the slave pen where Solomon Northup was trafficked through New Orleans, ultimately to go upriver to some parishes out the Red River, where he chronicles in 12 Years a Slave. It's also where Kate Chopin's The Awakening is set, on essentially the same block as the pen where Solomon Northup was held. And it resonates in more contemporary times. John Dos Passos lived on that street for a while. The great movie Down by Law kind of captures some of it as a nightscape. And and in between, it's Jelly Roll Morton, where Jelly Roll Morton grew up. It's where the great clarinetist Barney Bigard grew up. Frank Ocean, Alan Toussaint lived out this corridor. It's Edgar Degas spent time there, the famous French Impressionist painter who had family along Esplanade. And I'm just skimming the first 10 things that come to mind. And I have to say, that was one of the challenging chapters, because it is so dense that I was sort of wanting to sort of move toward a straightforward history, but realizing it's just too complicated and the layers are too dense. And so that was the chapter that I worked on for quite a while. That's, I guess, in a thumbnail, a kind of glimpse of Esplanade, and that is the 3rd of the 5 streets I explore. And again, I do the 6 chapters about the outskirts, which oddly enough is where the most significant activity is happening now, literary activity. It's being displaced from the traditional epicenters of the culture because of gentrification and a variety of forces. And it's springing up now in what we call New Orleans East, a little ways, a couple of miles east of the heart of the city, or across the river on what we call the West Bank. So that's kind of to give you a sense just of the complex associations that just spin, Chris's metaphor of concentric circles and a palimpsest, both absolutely applicable here as well. And a similar kind of story, 18 million tourists roll through this city of less than 500,000 people every year, at least between Katrina and the pandemic. 18 million a year. So 36 visitors for every one resident. Data flow. There are transients, a long history of what we call strangers passing through town. Tourists is the more contemporary term, but strangers passing. It's always been a part of the place, a transient culture, shaping it indelibly.
Wonderful, wonderful. Now, actually, this is it's something that we'll have to discuss for both books. Is how your books help, because the TR just mentioned tourists, and tourists need guidebooks, and so in fact you opened by saying that before you arrived, you went to a bookstore and got a tourist guide and read all about it. And then you started, as it were, populating and reading more. So that both books can act as useful, not just supplements to tourist guides, but also books that texturize the spaces. Even the account that you've just given of the Esplanade helps to give the Esplanade a certain kind of cultural texture that a tourist guide likely will, but the tourist guide will tell you about restaurants, or pubs, but it will not texturize the city imaginatively. So I can see how both books will be useful for that. Now, Morash, on the emotional zones question. Now I see right behind you, of course, Ulysses, the edition that was edited by our own Catherine Flynn, a magnificent book. Let's make a plug for it.
Yeah,
everyone must. It's wonderful. I'm glad you've shown it. Now, of course, Ulysses is a very emotionally textured book, which, in a way, it as it were, it sort of, in a way, is predictive of your more critically systematic mode of it. Now, how do you, so first of all, talk to us a little bit about this emotional zones, and how do different writers allow you to distinguish between the emotions and the zones?
I suppose when we were working on these books, one of the things we did was we kind of deliberately kept the kind of theoretical apparatus under the bonnet, right? So you don't get those kind of theoretical debates. But where this idea comes from is really the French situationist Guy Debord, and his work on what he calls the Society of the Spectacle. And one of the things Debord used to do was he would get together with groups of his friends, and they would make sort of alternative maps of Paris, and they would basically just go for a walk. They would, in the words of the great jazz trumpeter Chet Baker, let's get lost. They would just go, and they would go for a walk, and they would just follow the kind of affective flows of the city. And it's the sort of thing we all do when we first encounter a city, I think. You go for a walk and you think, okay, this street feels like that street. This belongs together. And then suddenly you go around a corner and you think, okay, I'm somewhere else now. This doesn't feel like that. It feels, it's either feels more dangerous. It feels more banal. It feels like it's a place of work as opposed to a place of leisure. It feels like something else. And I suppose what Debord wanted us to do was, instead of have the city presented to us as a spectacle, and you mentioned the guidebook, that's quite often what the guidebook does. Here's the thing you want to go see because it's a big monument, because it's a spectacle. He wanted you to kind of experience the city and experience its texture and its memory and its emotion. And to me, it's the literature and the music that you need for that. And you need that in all its contradictoriness. That the writers that I'm looking at and that TR is looking at, they're not all really complimentary about the city. In fact, a lot of them are very, very critical of the city. So that you really get the texture of the city when you get writers who are delving into its dirty secrets. And that's where you really get a sense of, that's why this place feels the way it does. That's why this street is different than that street. Because there had been some sort of institution here, some kind of crime here, that this used to be a red light district, that this used to be whatever, that you get a different feel in these parts of the city as a result. So that was, for me, that's the kind of the deep, conceptual infrastructure. Now that is, that's not there on the surface in the book,
Yeah,
but that's the scaffolding that sits down underneath it.
I can see now. Also, there's a whole new area. I don't think we fully theorized the psychogeographies.
Yeah.
So people go on psychogeography walks of London or Dublin and so on, and they are supposed to write their impressions. So it's very impressionistic. But what you're describing is much more systematic. I wonder if you could give us an example of a writer who evokes the not so happy part. So I don't want to say negative, but the contradictory, you mentioned red light district, for example. So one writer who emotionally, gives us a kind of a little bit of a contradictory aspect of Dublin. Could you give us an example?
Oh, how long do you have? I mean, look, you take one of the great Dublin playwrights, Sean O'Casey. He writes this trilogy of plays in the 1920s, The Shadow of a Gunman, Juno and the Paycock, and The Plough and the Stars, which are all set in the tenements in Dublin's north inner city. And you have these characters who are just larger than life. I mean, these are plays that still hold the stage because the characters are so good. Actors love to play these characters. But what makes the characters work is that they're living in these tenement conditions that don't allow them to grow, don't allow them to flourish, that are constantly throwing them against one another. So you get these characters, great characters like, say, the Paycock, Captain Boyle in Juno and the Paycock, who's kind of larger than life, declares the world's in a terrible state of chassis. And yet he's constantly colliding with his wife, Juno, who's trying to keep the family on track. And really what O'Casey's doing there, it's a critique of the space in which they live. That if they had space, if they weren't confined in these little rooms, they would live much fuller lives. They'd be much less interesting dramatically. But they would live very different lives. And that's what literature gives you, that, say a guidebook that tells you to look at the pretty buildings doesn't give you.
It doesn't give you, yeah. Actually, that's a really good example from Sean O'Casey, which I'm not familiar, but now that you've mentioned his spatial sense, I'm going to familiarize with him myself, because of course, in New York, which we all three love dearly, the tenement literature generated about the tenements always speak about the constraints on self-fashioning. So a place like New York is a place of self-fashioning, or Dublin or whatever, but the living conditions specific to the tenements, which were nasty piece of work. So it's interesting. So we could do a comparison, between what you just described with Sean Casey as a kind of casting a light on a topical problematic that many cities that have slums, city slums generate for persons, characters. So I know that's just wonderful.
Yeah, so, if I just come in on that as well. I mean, the first thing that happens in his play, The Plough and the Stars, is this couple who live in a tenement who are trying to self-fashion. They're trying to fit a lock on their door because there's no locks on the doors in the tenements. They're trying to create their own space. And the resonance that has in cities like Dublin today, where there's a housing crisis, is very, very powerful. Where those same issues of how do you self-fashion, to use that term, which is a great term, when you don't have enough space to live in, is it's not just a question for the 1920s. It's a question for today.
It resonates, yeah. That's wonderful. So T.R. John, you introduced a character who he is a white guy who tried to pass himself as Black. But this passing, you unpack. I was very I've never heard of this dude before. Could you tell us something about the character of this passing, the process, and how it connects to how other writers come to pass in the city.
Yeah. You know, for me, that particular case of John Howard Griffin and his book,
Yes.
Black Like Me, for me, that's kind of my entryway into talking about Royal Street, in which I argue that self-fashioning and even the theme of double identity and masking is the central trope that organizes a lot of the literature that flourishes historically up and down the corridor of Royal Street through the French Quarter. John Howard Griffin, what an extraordinary story. What a strange experiment he conducted. And it became a phenomenon. The book sold 10 million copies, translated into, I don't know how many languages. It's still, more or less canonical in high school curriculums and so on, I suppose. But in the mid-'60s, it was an important text of that moment of the civil rights struggle, and so vexing and strange. He had lived an extraordinary life. As a 19-year-old, he was a medical student in Nazi-occupied France and began to rescue Jewish children, take them to the border, get them on boats to England. His name ended up through an informer on a Gestapo death list, narrowly escaped, ends up fighting in the Pacific, is blinded in combat there, stays blind for 10 years, recovers his sight, and then perhaps in a kind of post-traumatic syndrome sort of way, decided to take grave risks here, using chemicals to darken his skin and move around the last stages of the Jim Crow South, or the first wave of Jim Crow South, I guess you could say. In the aftermath of a lynching, he goes sort of poking around in the environments where that happened. An incredible risk. He ended up okay initially, but after the book was published, he was severely beaten, and it took quite a while to recover. It's an incredible story. But for me, aside from how astonishing it is in its own terms, it's a way into talking about Royal Street, where the social complexity has been so dense, so rich for so long, that it's the kind of place where historically you can kind of be who you want to be. You can take on a mask and adopt a persona and see where it leads. When Walt Whitman visited the city in the spring of 1848, he had never been, despite his years in New York, had never seen such a profoundly diverse social fabric. Lafcadio Hearn says just a couple of decades later, every race the world boasts is here, including some that are found nowhere else, he claimed. An incredibly complicated place. So much so that, he was just, it's a place where masking, self-fashioning, maybe too mild a term for it. The history of people who have kind of self-invented a whole new persona. When Faulkner was living on Royal Street, he invented this entire past about how he was injured in World War I, total fiction, walking around with a cane, claimed he had a silver plate in his skull, that he was descended from plantation, all utter and complete fabrication. But he went with it, and it was part of how he seemed to open a portal in his imagination during his time on Royal Street that led to, immediately after he left, a 10-year explosion of creativity in which he produced all of his major masterpieces, Light and August, Absalom, Sound and Fury, As Lay Dying. All of that came in the 10 years after he left, basically the corner of Pirates Alley and Royal Street. And it's that fellow, he's the most sort of extreme example of it, but it's really the story of Royal Street, to me, is the story of masking, the story of radical self-fashioning as an opening into the broader possibilities of the imagination and the art and literature that flows from that.
Oh, that's yeah. Because when I read, I said, "Wow, this dude is very brave and self-inventive."
Yes, sir.
He's very self-inventive in the most colorful way, and I use that word,
Ato, if I could just come in there on that as well. I mean, it just, as TR was talking, it struck me, here's something that connects these two cities, is maybe, and maybe this is a feature of a city of literature, is the potential for self-fashioning.
Yes.
My office in Trinity is in the building that Oscar Wilde was born in. And one day I was working out the layout of the rooms, and I figure I'm actually in probably the room he was born in, the nursery. And I mean, and there's the godfather of contemporary self-fashioning, Wilde.
Yeah,
the person who made self-invention into a modern art. Yeah. And I think, it's one of the things that a real city where the literature is tangible has, is the writer as a public figure. there are lots of cities that writers live in, but you never see them. You're not really aware of them. And I think in both Dublin and New Orleans, there certainly have been periods, and really even up to the present, where, if you go to the right pub or you're going to, certain places, you see the writers, you're aware of them. And so that even people who don't read the literature are aware of the writers. And it makes it a writer's city in a very particular way.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. So actually now this brings me to the water question. Let me start with TR, because you have an entire chapter, the outskirts chapter. It's where you describe the relationship between the city and the sea, the marshland, swamps, and so on. And the writers who have been inspired or scared by it. And I'll formulate a different kind of question for Chris and Dublin. So tell us a little bit about, because that was also very fascinating to me, because it's a different kind of borderland, than a borderland which is, as it were, a land contiguous. So it's not a borderland which is land. It's a borderland which is water and is full of peril. Please tell us about basically the outskirts chapter.
Thank you, Ato. Yeah, such a rich point. I think what makes New Orleans so distinct is that it's surrounded by swamps. And the really pertinent fact about swamps is that they are impossible to police, which is to say that the borders become very porous. Enforcing a border, policing a border when it's land contiguous is not that hard to do. When the borders are swampland, it can't be done. And so what this meant for the possibilities of marriage, of the enslaved escaping into living in a certain kind of freedom, potentially radical freedom in some ways, the way too in which just government in general is going to be a tentative and provisional prospect, this place. The privateers, the pirates, are really calling the shots. There's a great little piece of lore, maybe apocryphal, but there was around the early years of the 19th century, the mayor of New Orleans said, Jean Lafitte, the pirate, is causing such a drain on the economy of the city because we can't tax any of what he's doing because it's all smuggled. We've got to stop him. I will give $50 to anyone who will bring me the head of Jean Lafitte. Well, a couple of days later, posters go up all over town from Jean Lafitte saying, I'll give $500 to anybody that'll bring me the head of the mayor. You guess what happened? Now that's probably apocryphal, but it captures the truth of the city. That is to say, it is a city in a very raw, very pure sort of way, in the sense that it's an assemblage of extraordinary range of different kinds of peoples that are in some ways, by definition, almost ungovernable, because with swamps, it's an outlaw's paradise. It is the dream of freedom for the enslaved. It is a pirate's gold mine. And so there's that in terms of undergirding the character of the city, or the sketchy character of the city, some people would say. But then we also, what this means in terms of climate change is obviously the overwhelming existential question of our time for this city. And, it was an abstraction and sort of a scholar's pursuit up until 2005, when Katrina hit. After Katrina, it's something we all think about all the time. I think about it every day. The necessity of being able to get out of here in a hurry if I have to. If my car doesn't seem very reliable, I've got to get a better car because I've got to be able to get out of here. The biggest issue, it seems to me now, and this to lead into the outskirts question, is beginning to sort of really think about what it would mean to not try to fight water. You can't do it. To defeat water, it'll never happen. We have to learn how to live with water and live with more and more water. And that means a very new kind of infrastructure, something that may echo Amsterdam or Venice, what we sometimes hear beginning to call rain gardens, the construction of what will be occasionally lagoons and canals, and in other times just sort of a brushy ditch between two lanes of road, for example, or in a vacant lot. That will be it's going to have to be a big part of the future of the city to the degree that it has a significant future. I don't mean to be so fatalistic, but there's just no getting around it. And in that outskirts chapter, the novelists and poets in particular who are living out there, this is areas that were absolutely decimated in Hurricane Katrina. And so their childhood or adolescence or early adulthood is absolutely marked and transfigured by the events that began on August 29th, 2005. They're exiled, they become part of a diaspora. Through incredible struggles, they make their way home against all kinds of government bureaucracy that does not have their best interests at heart, and through a driven, heartfelt struggle to come home, they have come home and have begun to mount what is the most vital literature in the city. I'm thinking of Maurice Carlos Ruffin. I'm thinking of Charisma Price. These are the really crucial figures today, and they are products of the outskirts where the menace of the ocean is something that is going to be the essential question they navigate in their New Orleans lives, and it already has been. Yeah.
Existential. So, Chris, Dublin and water. Well, it too has a relationship, which gets reflected in the literature.
Yeah, I suppose the great line about water in Dublin is in Ulysses, when Stephen Dedalus steps out on Sandymount Strand, which is, when Dublin Bay, when the tide is out, there's this vast sand flats. And he asks, am I walking into eternity on Sandymount Strand? And that sense of, I think the relationship with water is much more benign one in Dublin than it is in, say, in New Orleans. There is that sense of the sea providing a completely different sort of perspective, a different sort of spatial sense. And I think one of the strange things about Dublin is that for a seaside town, or a port really, you very quickly get into parts of the city where you don't have a sense of the sea. You get once you get away from the sea, you're no longer aware of it. It's partly because there are what in Ireland we call the Dublin Mountains, but are not mountains by anybody else's standards. If I call them Dublin Mountains to somebody from Switzerland, they would laugh. They're hills, but they rise up kind of behind the city. So very quickly, the dominating kind of geographical feature is not so much the sea as the mountains. And likewise, there's an awareness of the connection to the hinterland, inland. There's another lovely passage in Ulysses where Leopold Bloom is following the funeral cortege, as in the Hades episode, and he crosses the canal, and his mind kind of follows the canal all the way inland to the Shannon River in the west of the country. So depending on where you are in the city, you're oriented either towards the rest of Ireland, to the Dublin Mountains, and it's only when you're really right beside the sea. So the sea always comes as a surprise in Dublin. That it's there, but when you encounter it, it's like, oh, look, there's this expanse. And writers use that. Seamus Heaney lived on Strand Road for many years. His workspace, he could look out over Dublin Bay. You have the Martello Tower that Joyce, of course, immortalizes in Ulysses. Now, we only lived there for a few days, but, it becomes a kind of symbolic space further down the coast. And this is, again, this amazing density of writers. Where Heaney lived, around the corner from him is where W.B. Yeats was born. If you stand in front of Heaney's house, you can kind of look down the bay to where the Martello Tower is that Joyce uses in Ulysses. And then beyond that, again, is Dunleary, where there's the pier, and Samuel Beckett uses that in Krapp's Last Tape, the play about this old man who's listening to tapes of himself as a younger man. And there's this moment where he remembers having this moment of revelation, standing on the pier in the howling gale, the anemometer spinning like a propeller. And then I saw it all. And of course, in the play, what happens is Krapp then turns the tape off, and we never see what he saw. But it's for Beckett, where does he cite what comes the closest he ever comes to a moment of revelation in a whole body of work that wins a Nobel Prize? It's the end of a pier sticking out into Dublin Bay. So that's kind of like I say. I think the ocean in Dublin comes as a surprise.
So, gentlemen, this has been absolutely magnificent. As you know, I love cities, and I'm going to make it a point to visit each of you. So be warned, with your books in hand, and we'll talk some more in situ in the relevant cities. I'm looking forward to that very much. This is, we've kind of, we're going to round up now because we've reached the end of the hour. Any last words about the cities in which you live and love and have written about, or anything else for our listeners?
I think
Let's start it. Yeah, Chris.
Okay, one thing I would go back to where we started at. One of the things you asked me is, how did all this start? And I went back to when I first arrived in Dublin in 1985. One of the very first things I did was bought a big map of the city, big enough to fit on the back of a door. And every time I went somewhere, I would sort of fill it in. And one of the things we insisted with these books from the outset was they were going to have good maps.
Yeah,
and the books are really built around maps. So they're books about space, but they use that visual element. And one of the things I'm sort of proudest of in the books are the maps and the way the maps speak back and forth to the text. So when you make your visit to Dublin, make sure you bring the book, because you've got the map as well.
I will definitely will. And also we didn't have time to talk about this. You also mentioned that you started writing the book in a form of COVID-induced exile.
I did, yeah. I live now outside of Dublin itself. I live in County Meath, about 20 miles outside the city. And I started writing this in April of 2020. So I couldn't go into the city. So it was, in a very modest way. Joyce writes Ulysses while he's in Trieste and Paris, and he can't, he's not in the city. In a very modest version of that, I was doing the same thing, trying to reconstruct the city for myself. So I spent a lot of time looking at kind of Google Street Views, just to be sure, okay, is that place as close to there as I think it is? And I would kind of follow through in Google Street View. But it was a kind of act of memory for me, and an act of reclamation through memory of the city that I really was missing. I was tangibly, physically missing it. And to be able to imaginatively reconstruct it in a kind of exile was almost a kind of healing.
I like the idea of COVID as exile. That's a very, very resonant. COVID as exile. So TR, any final thoughts?
Yeah, like Chris, I really got rolling with this project in the summer of 2020. I think it was sort of June of 2020 I decided to go ahead and do it, started writing in July. And in the same kind of mode, an important sort of figure for me is the idea of the river. And, the old familiar chestnut that you can't step in the same river twice. New Orleans is like the river in that it's changing all the time. It's changed so much, and it changes so quickly, and the changes are so dramatic. And yet there's still a thread of continuity. It's still a river, as it were, but it changes constantly. And so I wanted to capture what the city appears to be to me. What in this moment of the early 2020s, a snapshot of what I know of what this has been, knowing full well that in just a generation or so, the meanings of all kinds of things are going to shift very dramatically. And so it's a kind of capture a moment of like, this is what it looks like now. This is what I grasp the history to be. This is how we talk about the slave markets. This is how we talk about Storyville. This is how we talk about the swamps at this moment, with the understanding that it's going to change. And so I hope that my book will have some value and use down the road a little bit as another generation of writers starts to sort of dig into this place, and it allows them to get a very vivid sense of the place where they are at that time, given the contrast, let's say, from what it is at this moment, as today is very different from, say, 1960, 1940, 1920 on back. And so I have this sort of great excitement about the incredibly kind of the kaleidoscopic changes, the twisting of the kaleidoscope that never stops here, to vary the metaphor, and to capture my moment. This is what I know at this time, and to see let that be a powerful kind of, dropping of the pin, as it were, at a particular spot, to see where things all are down the road a little ways, as the clock keeps going, and as the world keeps changing, and as the city keeps changing. I've loved doing it. During the pandemic, I would be writing all day, and then there were no tourists in town. There was nothing. Their clubs were closed. The restaurants were closed. The streets were empty. And so sometimes I'd get together with some neighbors and some friends, and we'd just go walking. The streets were empty. And I was so full of all this information from working on the book that the way these empty streets kind of sang to me as I walked down them at 11 or 12 o'clock at night, as empty as a ghost town at the height of the pandemic, and just feeling these buildings, these streets, these trees kind of talking to me about what this has been and what it's going to be. And this is my little sliver of time to try to catch it and hold on to it for a second. And I'm so grateful to have had this opportunity, grateful to Chris, to Ray Ryan, to the whole team at Cambridge. And thank you, Ato, for this beautiful conversation.
I hope we're grateful to you for giving us this version of New. We are very grateful. I'm extremely excited to see your books in print. And as I said, you've been warned. I'm going to visit each of you with your books in hand. Thank you both.